Before we get started, let's introduce ourselves, and I'll start with myself. I'm Markle Tumlin, and I am a reference librarian at San Diego State University. I'm the bibliographer for English and American Literature, and I'm also the chair of San Diego State's Comic Arts Committee.
I'm Pamela Jackson. I am the information literacy librarian and also TV, film, theater, new media, and we recently started doing comic arts. So Markle and I, it's been a long day, are sharing that.
I'm Robert Ray. I'm head of special collections and university archives at San Diego State. We have a comics collection that we've archived. We're doing oral histories that we're going to archive and make available in special collections.
Okay, and Michael Lappins is at the end of the table. He came dressed as the Invisible Man today. No, actually Michael is on the committee, and he's been a very important member of the committee. But he's also doubling as the guy who is doing, organizing all the videotaping and all the archiving of this conference, and so he's kind of running around. And perhaps some of you have seen him out there running around, but
Or heard him,
yeah. Anyway, he might pop in today, but we're really not sure. But at any rate, we wanted to put his name badge up nonetheless. Anyway, the focus of today's session is to talk about the oral history project that we're working on here at San Diego State. But before I jump right into that, I'd like to give you just a little background about San Diego State's relationship with Comic-Con and kind of how all this started coming about. As you know, Comic-Con here in San Diego has been in existence for over 40 years, and a lot of you are familiar with the history, how it started out kind of small downtown and then blew up into the big thing that it is now. But our involvement at San Diego State, as far as being more actively involved with Comic-Con, probably only goes back to the last decade or so. I started at San Diego State in 1998, and at that time we really had no focus on Comic-Con at all. And I would say probably in about 2005 or so, there started to be a rising interest in Comic-Con, largely because it was kind of exploding all over, my relatives were calling me from Alabama and saying, what's up with this Comic-Con thing? And I mean, it started being really, really widely known. And so that drew a lot of attention to from university administrators and things like that as well. And so in the mid part of the last decade, we had a table there a couple of years, and got to meet a lot of cool people. And then things kind of lulled for a while, but last year things started taking off. First of all, there was a grant that was awarded to the university for the Comic Arts Project, and I'll let Rob talk about that more in just a second. But after that happened, we also hired a new dean, and she was very interested in pursuing these interests. And so in September of last year, she assembled the Comic Arts Committee and basically just charged us with, let me get the exact quote because I don't want to misquote the dean. But the exact quote was, she charged us with exploring new ways for the library and campus to optimize participation in and association with Comic-Con. And so that's basically what we've been doing. And although we already had the oral history grant, it kind of got folded into this committee, as kind of overlooking all the Comic-Con-related stuff that we were working on at San Diego State. One of the things we've done as a committee, and you'll be able to find information on your own, we've put together a website. And after the committee, I've got lots of materials up here with the website address on, and after the meeting's over, if you want to come up and grab these, feel free to. But it's basically just to promote the work of the committee, make people aware of what's going on at San Diego State, and to just kind of encourage Comic-Con related activity. And so I'm going to give you kind of just a brief overview, and then we'll talk specifically about the oral history in just a second. If you come directly to the webpage, the first thing you're going to see is this mesh-up of some of the material that we have in special collections. We have that available on these cards as well. And so when you come to the website, that's the first thing you're going to see. And then there's going to be a series of buttons that look like this on the side that will take you to the specific page. Now we have a little bit of history of the Comic-Con committee under the About here. We've done it in a really cool comic book format.
This is a mashup. It's not what the actual webpage looks like.
Oh yeah. This is just like snapshots from the webpage. This is the dean giving us our charge right here, and then this is the committee. We started, actually from the very beginning, we started meeting weekly just to plot strategy, figure out what directions we wanted to go in, and that sort of thing. And so it's been a very, very active committee, I will say that. And one of the areas that we were working on was the collections in the library. And I will say that one of the things that really got us interested in this also, I go back to the mid part of the last decade, And that is that we had a graduate student who just started giving us all this really cool, neat stuff, and he had a big interest in comics and Comic-Con. And so a lot of that came from him, but we have other stuff that we've been building on as well. And I'm going to let Rob talk about that for just a second, because Rob is our special collections librarian, and much of this material is kept up in the library's special collections area. So Rob, if you want to.
Well, our collection is not mainstream at all. It's alternative, independent publishers. Some are just one of a kind, single issues. But we think that what we're collecting, we're doing two things. We're collecting things that probably won't be saved, but they're just as important, and they are. They carry with them things that Comic-Con goers go to Comic-Con for. So they're edgy, but and underground comics. But comics have always been a vehicle for expression of ideas, and that's what we're looking to document is the imagination. And I've learned a lot from Greg Bear, and one of the things that he's taught me is that in comics you'll find the modern mythology, and anthropologists are going to have to pay attention to comics, to popular culture now, because in those is the mythology of our time. For our students, we're trying to collect literature that's used in many of the classes that they're in. So we have a lot of comics and an associated zine collection that deal with gender issues and sexuality, and for that reason are used very heavily. Our students find the comics collection quite awesome, actually. We have, for example, the drawn book works of Donna Barr, who is one of the most extraordinary drawn book artists around. We have her entire collection, and that's the material up in the right-hand corner there, and deals with some very controversial and shocking issues. But we also have the works of J.R. Williams, who was a cartoonist between the wars, and his cartoons deal with some of the issues between the wars. The Bull the Woods strip and the Out Our Way strip. We have Spiegelman's Raw, and in Raw, Mouse appeared for the first time. So we have all the signed editions of Raw. We have comics created at Sdsu during the Depression by someone who later became head of the art department. So I think our collection, like Mainstream and others, but maybe to a greater extent, deals with the things that comics really are about, which is creative ideas, inspiration, fantastical dreams, and wild imaginings. The last point, I think, is what we're collecting documents a change in, I think, American culture, American education, higher education, which is this highbrow or is this lowbrow? And what's happened since the 60s and 70s is that's been turned upside down, so that now highbrow is lowbrow. And I think we're continuing to work on a collection that demonstrates that. We also have a zine collection which crosses over very well with many of the same themes and issues in the comics collection.
Worked on a lot just within the past year, since this committee's been formed and we've had a lot more emphasis on Comic-Con, is to try to do more documentation of Comic-Con itself. And one of the great acquisitions we had in the past year, actually just within the past few months, in fact we got the letter signed at Comic-Con this year, which was kind of fitting, was the Richard Alf papers. And many of you know his name as one of the key founders of Comic-Con. And Rob actually appeared on the Richard Alf panel at Comic-Con this year at the Comic Arts Conference. And I'm going to let him talk a little bit about the material that's in that collection because he's a lot more familiar with it. And also about the acquisition of that collection.
Well, it hasn't been processed yet, so I don't really know what's in it, but looking through it in work you do prior to processing, it documents the first few cons and so forth. It also documents Richard's business adventures and his business endeavors. That was one of the things that made him so important to the success of the early cons, was his business sense. He had wide interests, and the collection, I think, will reveal, will document that. Richard's one of these people, this group of people in late 1960s, early 70s. I mean, Richard was already a businessman at the time, and all these
And he was,
people.
what, 17, I think,
Yeah.
at the time. Yeah, he was
Yeah.
17 years old when he was doing a lot of this stuff. So.
And yeah, he had the car, which got people around. He was able to bankroll certain things that the adults in the group were not able to do. And his collection, I hope, will help us understand just what happened at that time, which has evolved into the spectacle, really, that Comic-Con is today. A group of people, Richard's much like them, very widely read, they thinking for themselves, doing things for themselves, very independent, energetic, and at the time unleashed something that, well, I think really changed the world. So I hope this collection will help us begin to understand that, as well as the oral histories that we know.
And I would like to add that we had originally planned to do an oral history with Richard Alf for this project, but unfortunately he fell ill right after we got the grant and started getting the thing going. And then he passed away in January, and so we didn't have the opportunity. That was very unfortunate that we didn't. But
There is, however, a small oral history of Richard along with Mike Towery that KPBS did for one of its morning shows. It's not that long, but it's real good, and it's available at the KPBS website. You can hear Richard talking about the early days.
yeah, and just to give you an idea of his influence, so I've told this story a few times during the conference. When I was a kid, about 13, living in Pennsylvania at the time, I saw a little ad in the back of a comic that said, back issue list, and so I sent off to Richard Alf's Comic Kingdom in San Diego, and I got the back issue list from him, but also included in that was something that I still have to this day, which was a little comic about yay big called Alf Comics #1. And I think he did 2 of those in the course of running his business, and then somebody did kind of a tribute #3 to him a few years ago. So I've got #1 and #3, but I still need to get #2. So, since I am a collector after all. So, at any rate, so Richard Alf papers, very excited about having those, and hope to get more of those. Another thing that we did early on was a survey of the faculty at Sdsu, because one of the things, as the dean charged us with, was not just to have the library collect, but to have more connections between the campus and Comic-Con. And Pam did the survey. If you'll just say a word or two about that.
Sure. We sent it out to the whole campus. We got about 78 responses, I think it was. And we were really trying to gauge the interest in comics in teaching and learning, to see what faculty are doing with it, and also to gauge faculty's interest in Comic-Con or as just fun for themselves personally. So the excitement was tremendous. So the people that responded, oh, I don't care about this. We did get those responses on the surveys, but the people who were interested, and quite a few were very excited about it. And then there's people who missed the survey that said, hey, I didn't get that survey, and I want to be on your committee. And so we've invited quite a few faculty to come talk to the committee.
One of whom I saw here this weekend.
Yes, and we've seen him here, yes. And just the things we learned from that, the things that they do in their own personal research or professional research, what they're using in the classrooms with students. So we learned about a campus class that actually creates a comic book. So there's a comic book being created on campus. And so just getting the communication going at San Diego State so that we all understood what we're trying to accomplish and what everyone's doing. So,
Okay, thank you. Really cool tag out on
yeah, the bigger the word, you know, the more that showed up in the opening today.
Okay, and this is a page that we have up on our website. On the
Technical difficulties,
Technical
even with
difficulty.
paper.
Yes, call it an IT person immediately. This is some information that we have up on the site about the oral history project, and you can see here a nice photograph of some of the early founders. We've got Richard Alf over here, Mike Towery in the back of the talk. That's one thing, we did one of the oral histories today, and the question was asked, Mike Towery, what do you remember about him? The response was, he was tall, very tall. And if you've seen him walking around here, he still is. So at any rate, you see him there, you see a Barry Alfonso in front, just some of the original group there. And down here at the bottom, we have some still shots from the first 2 oral histories that we did this summer. And in fact, there's Mike Towery right there. You might recognize him. And over here on the right, we have Jackie Estrada, who is still involved with Comic-Con to this day. In fact, I think she runs the Eisner Awards, I think is one of the things that she does. And anyway, still very active with that today. And she's here this weekend too, so you might have seen her running around as well. But these were the first 2 that we did this summer. And we've continued working on them this weekend, actually. We've got a very exciting weekend this weekend, but we'll talk about that more in a second. But I just want to give you an idea of what they look like when you look at them online. And then back here in the back, we've also, we are librarians. We are, Pamela and I both work in the reference department at least, so we have put up a research guide. We have research guides on the library's webpage for all the different disciplines that are taught at the university. But since we're so interested in this project, we did put up a research guide for just how to do research in comic arts. Some of the databases you would go to look at, some of the sources that are available, out there in the world at large, various archives that are located at different universities and that sort of thing. And then just briefly here, I would like to mention that Comic-Con would not be complete unless you had your own button that you designed to give out at Comic-Con. Buttons are very big. So we had a button designed this year by one of our alums named Lalo Alcaraz, who does the La Cucaracha comic strip.
Oh, yeah.
And he has been so awesome in just, what's his
He said, go nuts. We asked him, can we use this? We asked permission. And that's what he said to Rob. He's like, use it on whatever you want. Go nuts.
Go nuts, yeah. And so, at any rate, you might recognize the characters of Eddie and was Eddie and Kuka, I think, their names. And if you haven't read that, you should get a hold of the compilation because it is amazing. It's a really great comic. And at any rate, so we used that on the button this year. And we also have it reproduced on some of our other materials as well. And then finally at the end here, we started drawing some attention to ourselves, as we hoped we would, and we have some links to some of the press coverage that we've gotten since the whole thing began. But what I'd like to do now is turn the focus to, thank you.
We'll keep it on that.
Oh, no, this would be better for what we're going to talk about next. Yeah, so what we'd like to do now is talk about what you came here to hear about, which is the Oral History Project. So I'd like for Rob to talk a little bit about the whole process of getting the grant and what we were, proposing to do, and then I'd like to hear from Pam because she's been kind of the production person this weekend, and she can talk about what's been happening there.
Sometime last year, about this time, maybe a little bit earlier, we applied and received a grant from the California Council on the Humanities. They have 2 sets of grants. One is Tell Your Story sort of grant, and the other is much more ambitious and documentary in nature. We received the Tell Your Story grant, and it is titled The Comic-Con Kids, Finding and Defining Fandom. And we wanted it to be a resource on the emergence of comics, science fiction, and fantasy in the youth counterculture movements of the 1970s, with the primary focus on the founding of Comic-Con. We're an academic institution, and in special collections and archives, what we're trying to do is document origins and try to explain the origins of things. In special collections, we hold primary sources and original primary sources. Much of the documentation on the origins of Comic-Con, there's some that's left over, but largely it's in the memories of those who are involved in it. And oral histories can be a terrific primary source because it's eyewitness, it's first person. Yes, the memory interprets itself. The memory interprets events. But we also have 40 years for which people can reflect on and interpret events. They're not necessarily doing that at the time they're creating history, but after 4 years they have this opportunity to reflect on significance and meaning and provide that interpretation through because they were eyewitnesses and they were there. So in terms of documents, which is what we're about, the library is supposed to be acquiring material that's reliable and accurate. It's a place where students and scholars and the public can go for accurate, reliable information. Information that's peer-reviewed and that has had some interpretation. So these oral histories are terrific sources for needs of our students and our faculty and the researcher looking into the counterculture and youth movements of the 1960s and beyond. So the original grant was to get really a half a dozen maybe oral histories, and these were going to be audio. And Michael Lappins, who's done
The Invisible Man.
such an amazing, terrific job in, first of all, deciding, well, video would be one step better, an improvement, for all sorts of reasons. And Pam has been...
And if I can interject just for a second, Michael also had a background in Hollywood before he came to San Diego State, so he had a lot of great technical production skills and that sort of thing. And so we decided to exploit those skills since he seemed to be willing to let us use them, and that's one of the reasons that the video happened as well. Anyway, Rob.
But from not necessarily humble beginnings, but we only had intentions for maybe a half a dozen audio interviews. Now it's become, I think we're approaching a dozen.
No, over that. We did 13 this weekend, and we have 15 so far altogether.
And we hope that this will expand, and next year perhaps we'll do another 13. But an oral history depends. It's a give and take, and what you get from it depends on your ability to ask certain questions, the right questions, but also when to be quiet and let the interviewees speak. But basically, we were trying to get at folks' interest in comic books, how that originated. And how they got involved in Comic-Con to begin with, both the founders and those who were involved immediately, but those who were involved early but not necessarily right away, and then try to place folks within the milieu of the 60s and early 70s, and try to get at social and historical issues. With regard to Vietnam, the counterculture, and so forth. Diversity issues, how soon were women involved, the place of comic literature and science fiction and fantasy and so forth within the counterculture.
A big part that came up in the interviews too is San Diego's history and how Comic-Con and San Diego grew together. So.
Yeah, I think what we're after is Comic-Con represents, I think, two things. for San Diego, it's one of the most important, if not the most important event in its history. There's no other event like Comic-Con in San Diego's history, and it has transformed San Diego. The other thing is what Comic-Con means to the rest of the nation and really the world. And so what we're trying to document is how San Diego changed because of Comic-Con, and how Comic-Con changed the world. We're getting stories from the past, but these people are helping bring the past to the present. But it's not really, what we're after is not really about the past. It's really, we're trying to document how people, in this case, young people, responded to life at the time. And again, I'll go back to Greg Bear. He said, we did what we loved. And that's what you have to do. You have to do what you love. And some of the interviews try to get at how difficult that can be sometimes, that it involves, I mean, you're in love with something no matter what. Well, no matter what sometimes involves sacrifice and can be difficult, but they did it anyway. So what these oral histories can do is be examples to our students and to our children today. So this is about, it is from the past, but it's really not about the past, it's about the future. These are examples that our students can use, so they'll be able to respond in certain ways of their own in love and devotion, and so it's really about the future, because if these oral histories can influence students in a certain way, they'll change the future. So it's for that young man back there. That's what this is for.
Yeah, speaking of the future, one of the things that's really impressed me in sitting through, I haven't been to every one, but I've been to almost all these interviews. And it's just interesting to see how Comic-Con affected the different participants so differently. And that they took these really interesting career paths, and some of them stayed more involved with Comic-Con over the years, some kind of came and went. But it was, we have everything from, comic artists to scientists, to people that worked in the comic industry in England. I mean, just really diverse paths that these people took.